Fred Rogers was the gentle voice of a generation, a man in a cardigan who made millions of children feel safe in a world that wasn't. But long after the cameras stopped rolling, the person who knew him best, his wife Joanne, finally spoke, and what she revealed wasn't scandalous. It was something far more haunting. For over 50 years, Joanne stood by Fred's side. She saw the man the world adored, but she also saw the pain he never let anyone else see. His silence, his discipline, his fear that he'd never done enough. And in her final years, she broke her own silence about his. Because Fred Rogers carried something heavy to the very end. And the truth Joanne shared before she passed left even his most devoted fans in tears. To the world, Fred Rogers was unshakable. He walked into our living rooms every day with a quiet smile, a soft voice, and a message that made us feel, somehow, like everything would be okay. There were no bright lights, no laugh tracks, no slapstick gimmicks. Just a man in a sweater, changing his shoes, and speaking directly to the soul of a child. But according to Joanne, his wife of over 50 years, there was more to that smile than anyone ever knew. Fred Rogers lived by a code of compassion. But compassion, she said, was a choice, a discipline, and behind every calm pause, every thoughtful word, was a man holding himself to an impossible standard. A man who couldn't afford to falter because too many people were counting on him not to. He wasn't playing a role. But the burden of always being Mr. Rogers was real, and it got heavier with time. Joanne remembered watching him return home after long filming days. Drained, quiet, lost in thought. There were no tantrums, no complaints, but the weight was there. The way he'd sit at the piano for hours. The way he'd disappear into silence. The way he'd ask, "Did I say the right thing today?" She would listen, sometimes answer, but often, she just sat beside him, letting him feel what he didn't dare speak aloud in public. Because Fred wasn't just responsible for a show. He was, in his own mind, responsible for childhood itself. For being the voice a lonely child heard when their world was falling apart. For giving words to emotions even grown-ups didn't understand. And the pressure of that, it didn't just follow him, it haunted him. He once told Joanne that he weighed himself every morning. Not for vanity, not for health, but because 143, the number he aimed for, meant something. I love you. 1 letter, 4 letters, 3. It was a code he lived by, a silent promise to every child watching. But that promise came with a cost. Joanne, a gifted pianist herself, saw it clearer than anyone. She'd watch as Fred gently avoided conflict at home, especially with their children. He wasn't the disciplinarian. That role often fell to her. He couldn't bear to be the source of discomfort, not even for a moment. And sometimes, she admitted, it created tension, resentment even, because kindness doesn't mean perfect, and gentleness isn't always enough. But still, he tried. That's what Joanne wanted people to understand. Fred wasn't a saint. He was a man who chose patience when he was tired, who chose softness when the world got harsh, who chose to keep speaking kindly even when no one else was listening. Not because it came easy, but because it mattered. And maybe that's what made his legacy more profound than any character or children's show that came before or after. He was real. He had doubts. He had pain. He had days when the cameras turned off and he wondered if he'd failed the very children he'd set out to protect. But every morning he put the sweater back on, because he believed that kindness could change a life, even if the person wearing the cardigan wasn't sure it was enough. And Joanne? She saw it all. Before he was Mr. Rogers, the man in the sneakers and cardigan, Fred was just a quiet music major at Rollins College. And Joanne Bird? She was the one person who noticed what others didn't. He didn't chase attention. He didn't perform. But when Fred played the piano, something stirred beneath his stillness. And Joanne heard it, not just in the music, but in the spaces between the notes, in the way he listened, in the gentleness of his presence, in how he gave people time to find their words, instead of rushing to fill the silence. That's where their love began, not in grand gestures, but in quiet recognition. They connected in practice rooms, in conversations that lasted hours, and in shared performances where their pianos spoke as deeply as their words ever could. Joanne wasn't drawn to Fred because of his charisma. She was drawn to his steadiness, his sincerity, and the depth he never showed off. And in return, Fred fell for a woman who saw him fully, not just the gentle side the world would one day come to cherish, but the private one who wrestled with doubt, who overthought every interaction, who held himself to invisible standards no one else could see. When Fred left for New York to start a job with NBC, it wasn't the end of their connection. It was the beginning of a letter-writing courtship that would span hundreds of handwritten pages. No texting, no video calls, just ink, paper, and the kind of patience most people forget how to practice. Then, one day, came the letter that changed everything. Fred's proposal didn't arrive with a ring or a dramatic speech. It was tucked inside one of those letters, casual almost. But Joanne knew. She ran to a payphone, heart racing, just to say yes before the moment passed. She nearly dropped the letter in her rush. That piece of paper became sacred, a symbol of a love that didn't need spectacle to be true. They married in 1952 and built a life that would stretch more than 5 decades. But what they built wasn't what people assumed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. It wasn't even always balanced. Fred's work was all-consuming. The emotional labor of carrying an entire generation's feelings on his shoulders took a toll. And Joanne? She held everything else. She raised their sons, managed the household, and created space for Fred's creative and emotional process. She wasn't just a partner. She was his anchor. When he was drained, she restored him. When he doubted himself, she reminded him what mattered. And when the world treated him like a saint, she kept him grounded in reality, loving him for the man, not the myth. But perhaps the most extraordinary part of their love was how ordinary it felt to them. They played piano together. They laughed. They disagreed. They had inside jokes no one else understood. When the cameras were off and the cardigan was folded away, Fred was just Fred. And Joanne loved him not despite that, but because of it. Their marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was a choice, made every day over decades, through exhaustion, through conflict, through moments of grief and moments of music. And that's the part no one saw. Everyone saw the gentle man on TV. But only Joanne knew how hard he worked to stay gentle. Only she knew what it cost him. And only she could tell the truth, not to tarnish his image, but to make it more human. Before her death, she shared this truth. Fred Rogers didn't love loudly. He loved with presence, with patience, with practice. Not just with words, but with his life. And that was the real magic behind the man the world called neighbor. For decades, Fred Rogers gave his audience permission to feel, to cry, to grieve, to ask hard questions. But when his own time came, when he faced the end, he barely let anyone see. Because even in his final days, Fred still thought about the children. He didn't want to scare them. He didn't want them to remember him as sick or fragile. He wanted to preserve that gentle image, the cardigan, the calm, the quiet strength. So when he first began experiencing discomfort, he didn't say much. Just small things. An upset stomach here, fatigue there, the kind of symptoms most people would brush off. But Joanne noticed. She watched him wince when he thought no one was looking. Watched the meals grow smaller, the silences longer. And she began to worry, not just as his wife, but as the one person who really knew how much Fred could carry before finally asking for help. The diagnosis came quietly. Stomach cancer advanced. There was no dramatic announcement, no public update. That wasn't Fred's way. He didn't want pity. He didn't want the spotlight. All he wanted was time. Time with Joanne, with their sons, with the life he had so carefully built. And so, even in illness, Fred kept showing up. Just weeks before he passed, he served as Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade, smiling gently from a car, waving to crowds who didn't know they were saying goodbye. It was a final gift. A way of being present, even when his body was already slipping away. Back home, things were quieter. After surgery to remove part of his stomach, Fred spent his last days in the company of music, family, and stillness. Joanne played piano in the next room. Sometimes he would join her, not to talk but to sit, to listen, to feel what he couldn't put into words. And in those moments, Joanne began to see a different side of him. Fred had spent his life being strong, for children, for parents, for viewers who needed hope. But now he allowed himself to lean on Joanne, to be held, to weep. He had always feared letting people down. Now he feared leaving them entirely. Joanne later said that watching Fred face death wasn't just heartbreaking. It was humbling, because even then, even when his body was failing, he still asked about others, about the show, about the neighborhood, about the world he was about to leave behind. In one of their last conversations, Joanne sat beside him and whispered, "We're going to be okay. The boys will be fine. And I'm going to try to be fine too." She said he looked at her with quiet peace. And not long after, on February 27, 2003, Fred Rogers passed away at home, just one day after his grandson's birthday. He was surrounded by love, by stillness, by the calm he had given to so many, now returned to him. For years, Joanne kept the details private. She didn't want to interrupt the memory people had of Fred, the neighbor, the comfort, the symbol of kindness. But as time passed, she realized that the truth of who Fred was made his legacy even more powerful. He wasn't gentle because he didn't suffer. He was gentle in spite of it. And Joanne, in her final interviews before her own death, made sure that part of the story was told. Not for sympathy, not for attention, but to show the world that kindness is a practice, not a personality. Fred Rogers didn't go out with a grand speech. He went out the way he lived, quietly, intentionally, and full of love. After Fred passed in 2003, many assumed Joanne Rogers would quietly fade from public life, that she would grieve, retreat, and let the world remember her husband on its own terms. But Joanne had spent 50 years beside the man the world called Mr. Rogers. She had watched him carry burdens he never spoke of, and now she carried her own. For a while, silence was her comfort. She guarded Fred's memory fiercely, almost possessively. She refused to let gossip or speculation distort the legacy of the man she had loved and protected through fame, illness, and death. But the silence started to feel dishonest, because Joanne knew what it cost Fred to be the person the world admired. She knew the toll it took to hold up the sky for other people's children while hiding your own pain. And she knew that if she didn't tell that part of the story, no one else could. So slowly, quietly, she began to speak. Not in viral headlines, not in salacious interviews, but in carefully chosen moments, at tribute events, in documentaries like Won't You Be My Neighbor, and in deeply personal interviews where her voice sometimes trembled. She didn't speak to correct the public's view of Fred. She spoke to complete it. Joanne told the world about his doubt, about the way he second-guessed himself after every episode, about how he would sit at the piano late into the night, replaying conversations and wondering, did I say enough? Did I say it right? She told the story of how he kept his weight at 143 pounds, his personal code for I love you, how every letter in his body, every routine in his day, was a reflection of a deeper purpose he never explained on camera. She told the truth about their marriage, not perfect but deliberate, not glamorous, but built on respect and renewal. There were disagreements. There were gaps in parenting styles. There were days when Fred's need for solitude left Jo, and feeling like the only adult in the room. And yet, she never resented him, because she understood him. She had seen the shadows behind the softness, and she loved him all the more for it. What Joanne wanted the world to understand is this: Fred Rogers wasn't a saint. He was a man who chose goodness, and sometimes that choice was exhausting. In her final years, Joanne was more than a widow preserving a legacy. She became a symbol herself, a reminder that behind every great man is a woman who often held the world together while he held the spotlight. She took on public events, spoke to young fans, led Fred Rogers Productions as chair emerita, and gave interviews that balanced wisdom, humor, and grace. And when asked how she kept going, she often smiled and said, "Because he still matters, because kindness still matters." But privately, she missed him. Every day, the music was still there. The home they built still stood. But the silence, that part she hadn't been prepared for. Joanne once said, "Wouldn't it be nice if you could just tell yourself, you've grieved. Now get on with it." But it doesn't work that way. Even 2 decades after Fred's passing, Joanne never truly stopped mourning him. She just turned the ache into action, into legacy, into a final gift for the world. And when she finally spoke before her own death in 2021, what she shared wasn't scandalous. It was sacred, a portrait of a man not made smaller by his flaws, but greater for having carried them in silence. Fred Rogers never raised his voice. He never shouted to make a point. Instead, he whispered truths that would echo for generations. And at the center of it all, beneath the songs, the puppets, the cardigans, was a simple code. 143. 1 letter in I. 4 letters in love. 3 letters in you. It was more than a catchphrase. It was Fred's spiritual compass. He kept his weight at exactly 143 pounds for most of his adult life. Not out of vanity, but as a daily reminder of what really mattered. Every time he stepped on that scale, he wasn't checking his body. He was checking his heart. Joanne knew this better than anyone. She'd watched him cling to that number through surgeries, aging, stress. It wasn't about health. It was about staying tethered to something pure in a world that often felt far too loud. And when Joanne finally shared that detail publicly, it became something millions of people carried with them too. I love you. 3 words that Fred Rogers never stopped finding new ways to say. And even in death, he was still saying them. In 2019, long after Fred had passed, the state of Pennsylvania officially declared May 23rd 143 Day, the 143rd day of the year, a day dedicated not to sales or celebrities, but to doing something kind, saying something gentle, being a neighbor in the truest sense. It was Joanne who helped make that happen. She worked behind the scenes. She gave her blessing. She showed up when it mattered. Because this wasn't just about her husband anymore. It was about the world he left behind. A world that still needed reminders of love. And Joanne was the last voice who could speak for him. She didn't try to replace Fred. She didn't try to recreate the show or modernize his message. Instead, she leaned into what hadn't changed. The need for calm, for truth, for emotional literacy. She helped launch and support Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, a spin-off designed for new generations but built on Fred's original blueprint. And when fans approached her with tears in their eyes, telling her how Mr. Rogers had saved them, she always listened. Sometimes she shared a story. Sometimes she simply said, "I miss him too." But the one thing she always did was remind people that Fred meant what he said. That when he looked into the camera and told children they were special just for being themselves, he believed it. He didn't say it because it sounded good. He said it because he needed people to hear it. Joanne once said that Fred worried constantly that he hadn't done enough. That even after 895 episodes, hundreds of letters and decades of service, he still asked, "Did I help? Did it matter?" It was only after his death that she realized he would never know just how much. And maybe that's why she broke her silence. Because someone had to say it. Someone had to tell the world that Fred Rogers didn't just make good television. He made a way of living. And that even when the cameras stopped, he kept trying quietly, imperfectly, beautifully. Joanne knew that people didn't need to hear that he was flawless. They needed to hear that he was faithful. To his values. To his mission. To his family. And above all, to the children he never stopped loving. Even as his own light began to fade. Fred Rogers never needed a spotlight. He didn't crave attention. He simply believed that every person, especially every child, deserved to feel loved. That belief shaped everything he did. And everything he didn't do. He didn't chase ratings. He didn't shout. He didn't sell toys or build an empire. He just showed up every day. In a quiet room with a sweater, a song, and a message that somehow made the world feel less frightening. But now we know something else. We know that his kindness wasn't effortless. It was intentional. It was hard-won. And it sometimes came at a cost only one person truly saw, Joanne. For over 50 years, she stood beside the man who carried the emotional weight of millions, and she carried his. She was his sounding board, his anchor, his sanctuary. And when the world started turning him into a legend, she never forgot the man. the husband, the father, the musician, the worrier. And maybe that's why her silence lasted so long. Because when you love someone that deeply, it's hard to share them. Hard to open the door to the private moments. The fears, the tears, the evenings where he wasn't Mr. Rogers. Just Fred, trying to figure it out like the rest of us. But in her final years, Joanne made a choice. She chose to break the silence, not to rewrite history, but to complete it. To give us a fuller picture of the man we thought we knew. Not to make him smaller, but to make him more real. She wanted us to understand that Fred Rogers wasn't some mythical figure of endless calm. He was a man who chose patience on days when he felt anxious. A man who gave joy even when his heart was heavy. A man who showed up for others, and only allowed himself to fall apart in the safety of the one woman who knew how to hold him. And in revealing that, Joanne gave us all one final gift. Because when we realize that even the kindest people are carrying pain, we learn to extend more grace. To ourselves, to others, to the quiet ones in our lives who may be hurting in ways we can't see. Fred Rogers taught us how to be good neighbors. Joanne Rogers reminded us how to love the ones who carry the most, and ask for the least. They are gone now, both of them, but together they left something behind. Not a show, not a quote, not a brand, but a way of living, a way of listening, a way of loving, and maybe that's what matters most. If this story stayed with you, the next one will stay with you even longer. Watch it now.